welcome to everybody out in the audience. As Isaac mentioned, I'm an attorney here in San Francisco, California, and I normally start the program by just commenting on the weather, and I'm going to go ahead and do that. It's nice, well, it's a sunny day here, but it is very smoky here. I suspect everybody in the audience may have heard of all the wildfires in the North Bay, and the smoke is very heavy here in San Francisco. But I'm blessed by not having any. There's not been any fires in the San Francisco area itself. But my heart goes out to everybody affected by the fires, as well as others in the United States affected by earlier hurricanes and flooding. So I hope that everybody out there is okay and healthy, and I'll start the program, and we're going to be talking about calculating overtime under Federal Fair Labor Standards Act. And so for the next 100 minutes, we'll be discussing this topic. And at the end, I'm going to reserve the last 10 minutes or so for your questions. And I wanted to also comment that if for some reason there are a lot of questions and I can't get to all of the questions, you'll see that my last slide is my contact information, and I would welcome any of you to email or call me if there are questions that don't get answered, or if you think of something later after the program has ended. All right, so with respect to the program, this is the first page of the introduction and agenda. And so one of the first topics we'll be covering is, why do you even need this information? By the way, I'm starting off with a fundamental assumption that I'm going to verbalize right now. I'm assuming that we're talking about employees within your organization who have already been concluded to be employees who are non-exempt, who are not exempt from overtime, and who would be legally entitled to be paid overtime for overtime hours worked. Now, by the way, if you've not thought about that fundamental assumption, whether the employees are exempt or not, that's a separate webinar. But again, if the employee is in fact non-exempt, then we're launching into this webinar, which is to help you to understand and deal with the complexities of how to calculate the overtime pay that these folks would be entitled to. One of the other assumptions I'm going to make is, well, let me articulate this. There can be significant differences between the federal law, the Fair Labor Standards Act, and how that law requires employers to calculate and pay overtime wages compared to various state laws that may apply to you, the employer, depending on where you are located and where you have your employees. In other words, you may even have employees in multiple states, all of which may have state-specific laws that sometimes will be different and vary from the federal FLSA, the Fair Labor Standards Act. And I wanted to just point out as a starting point that it's important to understand that there are these differences between federal and state law, because as an employer, you can be led astray if you are applying the federal law principles that I'm going to be discussing today to employees in a state with differing laws. In other words, laws that differ from the federal law. And if you pay these employees in compliance with the federal laws, you may not necessarily be complying with the state laws that may be more stringent and require a more employee-friendly calculation of the overtime. Now, it's not possible for me to cover every state's laws, but I do need you to understand and be aware of the differences in your state with respect to employees that you have in a state where those laws may be different. Now, if you are in a state, though, that simply follows the federal FLSA in computing overtime wages, One of the things that, and the purpose of why we're even talking about this, is that the law is technically very complex as to how to achieve proper overtime pay calculations.